This episode is going to explore ancient Egyptian mythology and how it relates to everyday ancient Egyptian concepts. Now, before we start, it is important to note that mythology in ancient Egypt differs depending on location and the period it was recorded in, resulting in a number of different versions. So, let's start with the creation myth. It's important to note that there's more than one. In fact, there were four that we know of, each connected to four major cities: Esna, Memphis, Hermopolis, and Heliopolis, also known as the City of the Sun, which is the version we're going to explore today. In the beginning, nothing existed, apart from the deep, dark, chaotic waters of Nun. Nun was a primordial deity, representing the chaos that existed in the time before time. Deep below was a perfect egg, which suddenly cracked. The spark of life broke out, and with a surge of energy, the primordial mound rose from the dark waters. Some Egyptologists have argued that the idea of a life-giving primordial mound originated from primitive burial mounds, which facilitated the ancient Egyptians into the next life. These mounds, of course, preceded the mastabas, which in turn preceded the pyramids. Anyhow, on this mound appeared Atum. He was the deity of self-creation. He brings his own light into the world and order from chaos. Atum was all alone. He also had the ability to self-procreate, and so embarked on the project of creation. First, he created Shu, the god of air, and then his sister Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. They would also become husband and wife. It is at this point in the myth that the first people were created. As the story goes, Shu and Tefnut fell into the waters of Nun and disappeared into the darkness. Atum searched and rescued them using his magic eye, and his tears of sorrow turned into tears of joy. And it was from these tears that sprang the first humans. This part of the story is believed to be a play on words. The Egyptian word for tears, remut, sounds almost like their word for people, remech. Shu and Tefnut had children of their own. First they had Geb, who was the god of earth, and then Nut, goddess of the sky. Nut was often represented as the sky, arched over the earth, represented by her brother Geb. She marks the boundary that separates the waters of chaos from the world. Every morning, the sun is reborn in the east and dies in the west, after which the moon makes the same journey through the night sky. Because the sun set in the west was often associated with the dead. As a result, the ancient Egyptians tended to build their tombs on the western side of the Nile, and the dead were often referred to as Westerners. Like their parents before them, Geb and Nut were also husband and wife, and their union produced 4 children: Osiris and his sister Isis, then Set and his sister Nefertiti. Osiris took Isis for his wife, and Set Nefertiti. Due to the sheer lack of characters at the beginning of creation myths, deities often end up marrying their siblings in order to get things started, and ancient Egyptian myth is no exception. Now, this was not something normal ancient Egyptians practiced. However, it was often done within the royal family. Pharaohs often married their sisters or stepsisters. They believed themselves to be divine, gods on earth, and because the gods did it, they did too. In their minds, it set them apart from their subjects. It was also an attempt to keep power within a tight clique and reduce the number of claimants to the throne. This group of deities were referred to as the Ennead, meaning 9, and it's the last 4 of these, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nefertiti, that our next myth focuses on. Egyptian myth tells us that the crown of Egypt began with a tomb and was passed down from father to son. The reason for this transfer of power was explained away by retirement, in some cases forced retirement. When Osiris took the throne, he was considered a good ruler. He taught the Egyptians how to plant crops and to harvest, and as a result they became civilized and built cities. According to the myth, he was so pleased with himself he decided to travel in order to civilize the rest of the world. The myth taught the Egyptians a number of things: that they were the first to learn to grow their own food, that they were the first to build cities, that the gods chose them over all other nations to rule over, that the role of Pharaoh descended from the gods, and that only the Pharaoh on earth ruled as a god, and that they were, in their own minds, a chosen people. In all his wisdom, Osiris failed to see his brother Set was deeply jealous and wanted to rule himself. Set plotted to usurp the throne, and when Osiris returned from his travels, Set organised his coup. He arranged a banquet in honour of Osiris. When the party was in full swing and the guests were all drunk, Set brought out a beautiful chest covered with precious stones. He announced a game. For the evening's entertainment, whoever could fit into the chest exactly would win it as a prize. Of course, he had previously taken his brother's measurements and had the chest made specifically. So, when it was Osiris' turn to lay in the chest, he fitted perfectly, and at that moment, Set slammed the lid shut, trapping his brother inside. He then had the chest, with Osiris in it, thrown into the Nile, where it made its way to the sea. Despite being a god, Osiris died, and eventually the chest, which was now his coffin, floated all the way to the kingdom of Byblos. There it washed ashore and got tangled up in the roots of a tree. As the tree grew, the chest became enclosed within it. One day, noticing how big the tree had grown, the king of Byblos had it chopped down and made into a pillar for his palace. Meanwhile, Isis, the devoted wife, had become determined to find her husband. She searched far and wide. Finally, her quest took her to the kingdom of Byblos, where she discovered what had happened. She then infiltrated the palace by disguising herself as an old lady and taking up a position as a nursemaid to the royal baby. Eventually, she revealed herself to the king and queen and explained why she was really there. The king, understanding her plight and wisely not wanting to cross her, allowed the pillar to be cut down so Isis could retrieve the chest and her husband's body. She returned the body of Osiris back to Egypt, where she hid it in the marshes of the delta with her sister Nefertiti. Using her magic, Isis took the form of a hawk and hovered over the body in order to become pregnant and produce an heir. And so, Horus was born. Isis then went into hiding to protect her newborn baby from Set. One night, however, whilst hunting, Set discovered the body of Osiris. Enraged, he chopped it up into pieces and scattered them all over Egypt. It is important to note that in the myth, Isis returned the body of Osiris to Egypt. The Egyptians believed that in order to reach the afterlife, they had to be buried in Egypt. For this reason, Egyptians never really embarked on a colonization program. They simply did not want to live and die beyond the borders of Egypt. Also, Set's actions in chopping up his brother's body was seen by the Egyptians as a despicable act. By doing this, Set was denying his brother a proper burial. In order to resurrect into the next life, the Egyptians believed that the body needed to be in one piece. Isis and her sister Nefertiti searched all over Egypt in order to find the pieces of Osiris and put him back together again. Eventually, they found all but one, his private part, which had been eaten up by a greedy fish. However, this was replaced by a wooden replica. Ancient Egyptians that had lost limbs were often buried with artificial replicas. They believed these replacements would become real and fully functioning in the afterlife. Osiris was put back together again, given a proper burial, and resurrected into the afterlife to become the king of the dead. When Horus came of age, he challenged Set for the throne. What followed was a series of events and contests known as the Contendings. In one challenge, they both turned into hippos. Another took the form of a wacky boat race. And there was a very intimate and sleazy incident involving Set, Horus, Isis and Aletis. In one story, Set gouged out Horus's eyes. The Eye of Horus became a powerful symbol and was worn around the neck as a protective amulet, and also came to represent the sun and the moon. Of course, as the myth goes, Horus did regain his eyesight. After many years, the gods became weary of the struggle, and the matter would be decided by a council of the gods. Eventually, after a bit of back and forth, it was decided that Horus would rule Egypt. So, let's take a look at the meaning behind the myth. The struggle between Osiris and Set is a representation of the two different landscapes of Egypt, the fertile and the barren. Osiris was the god of agriculture and the annual flooding of the Nile, which made Egypt so fertile. In the myth, he taught the Egyptians agriculture, which allowed the Egyptian civilization to flourish. Set, on the other hand, was the god of storms and the desert. The deserts that bordered Egypt were desolate and inhospitable, and the storms potentially threatened the harvest. Therefore, their struggle was the contrast between the fertility of Egypt and the barren wasteland that surrounds it. It was the resurrection of Osiris that represented the rising of the Nile, which allowed the crops to rise for harvest every year. Resurrection was a central concept in the Egyptian religion. Osiris' resurrection into the afterlife also opened that possibility up to all Egyptians. And we see throughout Egyptian history the dedication Egyptians went through in life to ensure they too resurrected into the afterlife. It is important to note the role Isis played as a powerful and devoted wife. It is only through her efforts that make this first resurrection possible. Isis was the goddess of magic, healing, marriage, motherhood and fertility. And it was her fertility that overcame the death of Osiris to produce his heir, Horus. The headdress she wears is a miniature throne and represents the throne of Egypt. The myth portrays her as the mother and protector of baby Horus. As far as the ancient Egyptians were concerned, the pharaoh was the physical incarnation of Horus on earth, and therefore Isis was the mother and protectress of the pharaoh. And by the end of the myth, we can see how the pharaohs saw themselves in life and death. Horus and his throne represented the living pharaoh, whereas Osiris and his throne in the afterlife represented the recently deceased and resurrected pharaoh. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.